Okay, kia ora mai tātou, ngā mihi nui, ngā rangatira mā ine iwi hui hui mai nei, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. It's an opportunity for you to have a chat with the panel and ask some of the questions that have come to your mind, having had hopefully the opportunity to read the report that was released last week. Today, we are recording the webinar so that if you want to come back and have a look at elements of it, or if your colleagues couldn't join and want to know what happened, they would be able to head to the Future for Local Government website and the recording will be posted there. Just in terms from the panel's point of view, just wanted to firstly acknowledge my panel colleagues who are with me today, Brendan Boyle, Gail Surgeon and Penny Holtz. I have apologies from Antoine Coffin, who's working away hard in the Bay of Plenty Regional Council somewhere. So he tenders his apologies for this afternoon. As a panel, our job is pretty much done now. Come the end of the week, the panel effectively becomes in a past tense, and the work and mahi of the panel passes to both, in the first instance, the Department of Internal Affairs, and we're fortunate that Fergus Broom is who's on the call today. Along with a couple of others, Martin Pinkard as well. We'll continue on with the DIA team helping the transition of our report through, and of course working closely with Local Government New Zealand and all councils. So today is an opportunity for you, having reflected on the report, to pose any questions or queries you might have with the panel. And in doing so today, if you use the raise hand feature within the webinar, and we will come to you. Alternately, you can add a question in the question and answer box, and our team will scan for those and pick them up. So we don't intend providing a presentation of our report. We did that last week to those who are able to attend, and on the basis that you've read it, you wouldn't want us just telling you what you've already read, but this is an opportunity for you to ask questions of us. So with that, we're gonna plow straight into it and see where the first question is. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of courage for the first person to raise their hand and get into it, and we would love to be able to respond as soon as you have. Oh, Kath, welcome, and thank you for all your support that you've provided to the review. It's greatly appreciated, along with the fabulous colleagues at Taitura. Really appreciated your support, but you're gonna help and kick the ball off for us.
Yeah, I'd like to ask two questions, if I may. One I asked at the launch, and I thought your answers were really, they really illustrated the tight line that you've had to walk in putting this review and this final report together, and that is what were the most difficult challenges that you faced and coming to a consensus on your final recommendations in the report. And then the other one is, if you don't mind indulging me, a lot of the things in the report do require legislative change to really fly and central government to come to the party. But what would your advice be to the local government professionals on this hui today about what they should be doing to prepare for the future over the next sort of 6 to 9 months while things are a bit uncertain? So those are my two. Thank you.
Thanks, Kath, and well, certainly, I think we can remember what we said the other day at the launch in response to your first question, and it would be good to share, because it was quite illuminating to each of the panel as to how each other felt what were the key challenges and issues. So I'm going to invite Brendan, Gail and Penny to reflect on that first question, and then I'll chip in with mine, because we all have some of the big, what are the toughest or most challenging issues we grappled with. We all had something different to contribute. So I'll pass to Brendan in the first instance.
Oh, thanks, Jim. Mine was this issue of entrenchment that we've mapped out in the report. So we'd really grappled with how do we create a stronger, more certain future around the purpose of local government in the absence of constitutional reform. And given that New Zealand is not, as I think we signal in the report, embarking on any significant constitutional debate, we thought we would insert ourselves into that by setting up this entrenchment. And the entrenchment, on the face of it, it might seem quite sort of academic, but from a constitutional and legal perspective, it's quite significant. And what it does is provide certainty around the purpose for long-term intergenerational thinking and investment. And that is something for both central and local government to get their head around. So it's a really significant step. Maybe it's my sort of legal background, but for me, that was quite a feature of where we ended up, and something that we really did grapple with in terms of how to give effect to this issue of cementing the purpose of local government around well-being. I'll hand through to Gail.
I think we grappled with tensions that are well and truly alive in local government. And one of those was, how do we keep the local and local government, because we heard that loud and clear, but also how do we make it easier for people to join up and get the heft or scale needed for some of the big things that don't necessarily have to have that purely local flavour. So that was a real tension of how to come up with something that would work for both of those. So we really challenged ourselves in the different ways of organising local government to ensure that the local didn't get lost. And Penny and I have both reflected on our experience in Auckland and how that probably didn't get enough attention, and the local democracy or local communities haven't always been well served by the big amalgamation. So that was a tension that stood out for me.
Yes, another tension was the focus on the role of elected members, strengthening the role of democracy through strengthening and, improving the quality of governance that we have around the governance table, and at the same time looking at citizen-led democracy as a really positive way of our community to step into a more powerful role, having those silent voices heard through participatory democracy, citizens' assemblies and the like, whilst holding that polarity of better democracy, better local democracy, but also better elected members. It was an interesting tension.
Thanks, Penny. And just by way of prep, Brendan, to Kath's second question about legislative changes needing to fly and advice in the interim, perhaps just give you a heads up that I'll turn to you next. But in terms of the toughest issues that I've struggled with, and I acknowledge the points that panel colleagues have made, it was the issue of roles and responsibilities through, and clearly the reform of Three Waters, or Affordable Waters as it now is, and RM raised a number of questions in the minds of councils in particular about, so what additional activities and responsibilities are going to pass and who should do what. And we received some advice early on in our review that's pretty much gave the full A to Z, from animal control through to zoological gardens virtually, of what should, an idea of what should be undertaken nationally, regionally and locally. And many wanted certainty, absolute certainty, what are going to be the roles and responsibilities of local government. And so as a panel, we grappled significantly with that issue about how do you ensure that the people delivering best value for the communities are the ones with the capacity, capability and resources, and it makes most sense. And so in response to the challenge of how do we realign roles and responsibilities, we decided that it needed to be a bespoke and nuanced approach where the needs and issues and priorities of one part of the country are not those of another, and therefore providing a blanket one solution for the whole country is the answer. We could only guarantee one thing, and that was we'd get that wrong. So rather, we've done two things. One is recommended that there needs to be a coming together of central and local government, and that was one of the reasons for the relational department that's been recommended by the panel, to look at those key roles and activities over time and see who's best placed to be able to deliver on that. So that was a key recommendation that sort of went to addressing part of that issue. The other, we've provided effectively a local first framework, which thinks about various roles and responsibilities and the features of roles and responsibility and who's best placed there. And from a premise and a starting point that really community and local should be the starting point for the consideration, and it goes to the aligned to the challenge that Gail alluded to in terms of who's best placed to and how do we need to be structured to ensure that we deliver locally as well as have the right capacity on the right occasion to deal with the bigger challenges. So that framework is again there to help guide the conversations that will no doubt need to be had over an extended period of time. So that was a real challenge from my point of view. How do we get our head around that issue when people were absolutely seeking certainty, but the reality is certainty can't be provided in the way in which people were seeking. So the second question of Kath was about quite a bit of this needs legislation change to get things underway, and we have provided a roadmap in our report to help guide that. And what advice would we give to councils in the interim, and Brendan and perhaps Gail and Penny also would want to contribute into that response as well.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Kath. Yes, the bulk of our recommendations will require some legislative or government policy, central government policy position, but not all of them. What I would suggest, if you think about the timing, and the government has been very clear that this is really something for the incoming government post October the 14th to get their head around, is between now and then, there's a couple of things I think you really need to do. One is, really get to grips with understanding the report and spend time with your elected members in terms of educating and collectively understanding the recommendations, the logic behind them, and particularly what that roadmap for the way forward might look like. So issues like the treaty, the funding recommendations, and particularly the reorganisation section, some of those are quite nuanced, and we've already seen some unhelpful commentary in the public arena where, some commentariat said, well, we're recommending 15 unitary councils, and that's just not correct. I think there's an opportunity for elected members via Taitoura and LGNZ to work really closely together and work with your elected members as officials to, as much as possible, get to a unified position as to what the sector believes is the way forward and what the sector's response to the report is. Then when an incoming government is in place, you'll be in a good position to be able to present a unified front and make it quite difficult for an incoming government to ignore. So you've got, let's just say, 6 to 9 months to really get to grips with it, to work with central government. There's hopefully DIA and central government and LGNZ will move towards establishing a steering committee in the near future And if that's the case, you know, you see the beginnings of that reform program and a response to the review taking shape, of which officials need to be working really closely with your elected members.
A couple of things that we've noticed along the way with the review is one, that local government hasn't flexed its own power very much in the future for local government. So as Brendan said, the more that can be done to get people together and get a cohesive position on the recommendations of the report, the more likelihood there is for strong advocacy. And if local government came together and said, this is what we want to be a strong system of local government for the benefit of communities, I think there would be an appetite to support what has been received pretty much as fairly either common sense, as local government said, or thoughtful, radical and practical, some people have called it. The recommendations do make sense as a whole package. So it's really going to take local government getting behind it to see this change happen. And the other part that I think we've seen is that for local government, a lot of it is about changing itself for the future. And some of that's been challenging because of all the constraints, the burdens, the pressure on local government. There's often not the headspace or the bandwidth to embark on that change. And I would just encourage people, even if you do have those constraints, try and find ways to embrace this kind of change and start to look at the culture and the mindset of your organisation and what are some of the things that really do meet the aspirations of communities or better relationships with hapu and iwi and be the change you want to see.
Just to follow on from what Gail's saying, it's been interesting, you know, Brendan touched on some of the commentary. There is a feeling always to be nervous when you're exhausted and worn thin, to be scared of change. But we're really aware, and looking at local government over the last 2 years, that there's some extraordinary stuff happening in local government, and I really want to salute that. And I think one of the critical things is to do a stock take of what you're already doing that contributes to our recommendations. And much of what's happening out there in local government land is already along a continuum to meet the recommendations that we require, or that we're hoping will change things for the better. And that for me is where the advocacy should start. Where are the gaps and what's needed to move those recommendations, move the dial along. And another couple of quick things just to echo the drive the process yourselves, don't yourselves be that actually works for local government is critical. And finally, that collaborative approach through Taitura and LGNZ to look at what other councils are already doing. Talking to Wellington Council a couple of weeks ago, they're going to use deliberative democracy to actually start drawing together their LTP. So things that can already be done that start that change that Gail's talking about, grab those small opportunities for things that can change without requiring legislation or major shifts in resources. Kia ora.
Thanks, Pam. And just further to that, if you're looking for some specifics, page 121 of our report, there are 12 actions that we've identified that people can get on with now, and as Penny mentioned, such as getting trials underway for deliberative democracy, but there are a number of others, investing in utility-based partnerships, advancing social procurement, a number of ideas, and many are doing those, but they may be some additional starters for people thinking about what can we do now rather than waiting for the legislative change to drive the process.
Jim, there's a question that was raised in the chat by James Clark, which I'm happy to just comment on. So not sure whether everyone can see it, but James had asked about what confidence or reassurance have we been given that central government of whatever flavour will be sufficiently invested in the report? And I suppose my response to that is I'm cautiously optimistic. While of course we're an independent group, we have had the opportunity and we were encouraged to be able to brief all of the political parties as we went through the review and with the findings. And my sense is there's a really strong interest right across the political spectrum on a lot of the recommendations. Of course, there's not universal agreement on all of them, and you wouldn't expect there to be. But I think the real proof, James, will be when we see the political party manifestos as they start to emerge in the next couple of months, because it would be hard to imagine that each party won't have a response to this report as part of its manifesto. So we will at least get a good sense then as to what they may or may not do. But, you know, overall, I think we were, as I said, sort of cautiously optimistic about the desire to tackle some of these things that we've identified, whether it be funding, the relationship particularly between central and local government struck a really strong chord with all of the central government folk that we talked to.
Thanks, Brendan. Fergus, we've got a question for us.
Kia ora, panel. Just noting that there's another question in the chat here. So given that the recommendations in section 3 around Te Tiriti and Te Ao Māori were heavily opposed in the individual submissions on the draft reports, what would you recommend local authorities do to bring the community along on the journey to Te Tiriti-based local governance?
Thanks, and that's we received a wide range of responses, it would be fair to say, but I think without doubt all of the councils who submitted to us were strongly in favour and supportive of a strong, authentic relationship with Hapuriri Māori, and we were heartened by that, and we saw that throughout our review. And my personal observation over the last decade is there has been a significant shift in the way in which all councils are thinking about their responsibilities and obligations. But as you note, across communities, there is still quite a gap in our report, and got talked about this morning, is the matter of civics education, and perhaps there's education beyond just the narrowly defined, but actually it's the culturally specific arrangements that we have in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which are unique, and how do we bring the best of Western democracy and Indigenous tikanga, Mataranga Māori, Te Ao Māori, how do we bring that together to build a strong and unique system that recognises and celebrates the special place that New Zealand is, and the special relationship that we have through Te Tiriti. And I think councils can play a huge role in role modelling what good looks like. There clearly are going to be a number of community conversations that are going to continue to occur in this space for some time to come. But as a panel, we aspire to see Te Ao Māori embedded in the identity of New Zealand, and it is reflected in all the ways we think and work and act and behave. And local government has such an important role, we believe, in actually demonstrating in our community how that needs to be led and being given effect to it. But it is a challenge. It is a challenging space, and it does require some brave leadership. And I don't know, Penny, whether you wanted to make some comments around the leadership that's needed in this space.
Yeah, Jim, I think you put it beautifully, and I think, you know, it's so easy sometimes for particularly the elected arm of council to say, well, we've heard from 50 angry people, so we need to step away from bilingual signage or renaming our parks and reserves or our council buildings. But I think the critical role of councils is in that leadership role for community cohesion, making sure that councils are the place where those challenging conversations can be had and should be bravely led. And, you know, despite I can't even remember how many angry submissions we had, the overwhelming sense that we got as we travelled around the motu was that most councils are on the journey enthusiastically and hopefully, and trying to be leaders in this area. And in talking to iwi and hapu and mana whenua, they are there to step onto that bridge and to assist people with on that journey. And I guess, you know, and this sounds probably a little bit trite, the only thing we can do is just breathe through our noses a little bit and allow some of the angry dog whistling to pass and just, you know, stay on that journey. And I guess supporting, you know, from you as senior council staff, finding ways to support the elected members as they get a bit rattly and nervous in the process.
Thanks, Penny. Fergus.
Kia ora again. If there was nothing else to contribute to that one, we do have another question which I think relates to points made earlier about what might be done with recommendations and the next composition of government. But what are the risks that government will cherry pick certain recommendations from the report which would result in a suboptimal outcome?
Brendan, do you want to have a crack at that first, and others might want to kick in?
Yeah, I mean, yes, there's a risk. What we have tried to do is present it as an interdependent package. And our very strong view is that if you want to get the best result, you should do it all. But we acknowledge that, you know, whichever government is in play will not share the same love across all 17 of those recommendations. Time will tell. So yes, any one that is not done does dilute it, but you know, we did set out throughout the report, in addition to recommendations, a whole lot of other findings and, if you like, little recs that are tucked away in there too. There is a bit of a hierarchy to it. I think, you know, people would agree that the funding issue has to be resolved, but I think the issue that you need to get your heads around as a sector is that central government is unlikely, in my view, absolutely won't invest a significant amount of money in the existing system. If they're working together with the sector and the sector is embracing change and the sector is in agreement with moving ahead with those recommendations, it'll make it a hell of a lot easier for central government to come to the party. So, you know, I think that's the big thing to get your head around is you're not likely to just get a big check and say, well, we're going to solve that bit of it. Money will come with expectations, and I think central government will be prepared to invest in a different system as long as local government really leans in and owns it.
We do have another question here from Sean Smith. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question, that would be great.
Yeah, ngā mihi, kia ora koutou. Thank you so much to the panel for this mahi, and I just you've actually already answered some of my questions, so thank you. But actually following on almost from the one that you just discussed, I am interested as to why, if there is any specific reason, the panel decided to not make any direct recommendations around reviewing some of the existing processes that local government is required to follow, such as the preparation of long-term plans, the onerous consultation processes, not just with that, but with all other aspects of decision making. I acknowledge what was sort of said in response to the previous question. There's the sort of mini scatterings of commentary on that in the body of the report. So I just wondered if there was a particular reason why you chose not to make recommendations about those things, and any other insights on that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for that question, and I'm happy to provide an interim, a first response, and others may want to add to that as well. We were quite conscious that we wanted to make a limited number of recommendations, so they didn't get lost. We noted other reviews where there are sometimes, can be 100+ recommendations, and each one dilutes the one next to it. And so we were very careful in thinking about how many recommendations, and the good advice we'd received is you need to put somewhere between 15 and 20 on the table. Any more than that, and that starts to lose its focus. So that's what we have. So that was a little bit of shaping as to how we worked through our recs. As Brendan did mention, throughout the report, we make a number of suggestions elsewhere, and we've been confidently advised that those who follow us will be combing the report, picking up those other ideas as well. You're right to mention, and throughout our review, we received lots of feedback about the current process, particularly around the long-term plan and engagement, and we both acknowledge and agree with that in our report. And in terms of approaches to long-term planning, they appear at about pages 110, 111 in our report. We talk about the need for a redesigned process that enables more community engagement earlier, that has genuine wider cross-section of community involved in considering such things as participatory democracy, participatory budgeting, need to review the whole special consultative process and the way in which that's currently framed, which is exhausting, whether the need for audit should be retained or not needs some further consideration. And similarly with the Rating Act, probably needs a jolly good dunk out and clean up as well. They sit there as important things which need to be looked at as a review, most likely, of the Local Government Act will be needed. There are good elements of the Local Government Act which shouldn't be kicked down the gully, but there are others that do need a tune-up. And I think the fact that there's a lack of trust in the system is reflected in the prescriptive nature of the legislation. The more prescriptive it is, particularly around process, that's probably a demonstration that there isn't a great deal of trust, and we need to provide more trust in local government to be able to deliver and do the job well on behalf of the community, and use a variety of techniques, not just defaulting to a special consultative procedure which only picks up a very minute part of the community in its engagement. So yes, we acknowledge there are many things that need to change. Hopefully that gives a bit of an explanation of our rationale.
Can I just add to that, one of the reasons why we've focused on the relational entity to really have a good chance at resetting the relationship between local and central government, and the new stewardship entity to really be a systems support for the ongoing changes and evolution of local government, is we didn't want to see a situation where in 10 or 15 years there's another review like what we've just done, but really hope that we're setting up the system of local government so it can renew itself, and some of these things that are a real burden on local government being able to do its best job don't have to wait for a review like this and for it to be addressed. So we heard very clearly the issues with long-term plans and how burdensome they've become, and that they're not actually enabling as much community outcomes as what they were intended to do. So we're hopeful that the system in the future will be able to pick up those things and make the changes in a more timely way, and that the whole system will be better set up for success in the future.
Could I just jump in there again, Jim, and point out, Sian, thanks for the question, but if you have a look at this section in the report that deals with the reorganisation, we're really clear that the operating model for local government needs a fundamental rethink. That is structure, but it is also capability, systems, processes, people, etc. So in that in that point you raise, you know, we were mindful of the processes that you're subjected to, and there's opportunities there for, you know, streamlining, agreed, but also working in a different way, more collectively across the system too. So, you know, we point out about the opportunity for shared or managed services. Some efforts are underway there already. So that operating model was not just about structure. It was about all those other elements as well. And that's also why you see recommendations in the report around investment to build greater capability, whether it be, you know, tūranga-based capability or more general, if you like, corporate business-like capability.
Thank you very much, panel members. That has answered my question. I much appreciate your time. Kia ora.
Fergus, again.
Me again. We've got a question here about whether you've considered other revenues for councils, other revenue sources for councils, such as gaming trust and lottery distributions going directly to councils. The benefits of this might be the removal of a layer of admin, and also proceeds of crime could be dispersed to local government for local solutions.
Probably fair to say that neither of those suggestions were ones that we directly considered. We did workshop with some professionals in the sector about, you know, what's the toolbox of financing and funding tools that needed to be available to support councils more effectively. And in our report, while there is a focus on recommendations that relate to transfers from central government to local government and central government paying rates and the like, within the body of the report, there are some further suggestions to try and give effect to the initiatives that some councils have already taken and have found very difficult. And again, the legislative framework doesn't necessarily make some of those things easy to grapple with. Probably further to Gail's point, really, it's about how do we keep the system alive? We should be, you know, there will be new opportunities, no doubt, and potentially new technologies which make different forms of revenue gathering more feasible, and we should be enabling those opportunities as much as possible. We do talk in our report about particularly how do we work more effectively with the philanthropic community, to whether there is an opportunity for contributions to be applied more to community outcomes that councils are leading. But we didn't think specifically about the two you mentioned. Probably my personal comment on that would be those funds are under a huge amount of pressure already, as community groups in particular are the main beneficiaries of lottery grants fundings, whether it's sport and cultural groups, and they're already well oversubscribed, and I'd be reluctant to want to suggest that we should be taking that funding and apply to local government personally, but that's a personal view. Fergus.
Good again. We've got a question about the critical path outlined in the report and associated costs alongside that, and whether central government would be contributing any funding towards progressing the critical path and how that might work.
Well, that is what, that is what we've recommended, that central government, together with the sector, should lean in and fund the early stages and through the transition process. We acknowledge that the kind of pressure that it's likely to put on councils from a resourcing perspective could be quite high. We've certainly seen that from other reforms that councils have been involved in. So we felt that it was appropriate that central government should provide some funding to help enable that. But no, there's no current check that's been written out for it, but it is our recommendation that central government do fund the transition. I would think not exclusively. Clearly, the sector has got to make capability available, and there'll be some cost there.
I think an issue that needs to be thought about early, and as most on the call will know, if reorganisation is to occur and there is a redistribution of activities undertaken, and particularly support activities, we know that efforts to join up ICT, as an example, can be eye-wateringly expensive, and that might be one of the barriers to helping councils think about their choices and options. And so I think that is one area where there probably does need to be a bit of incentive, if you like, to come from the centre, which would take some of the pain out of that reorganisation and the costs of getting the back of house realigned to better deliver value for councils that they work with on an ongoing basis. So that would be one in particular that I think the next phase of the review should look at.
You might note too from our recommendations around the reorganisation and some other matters that we're not advocating for, efficiency and savings. That's often a position that's adopted around change processes. We're not confident that that's appropriate. This is really more about a more effective system, which is going to require greater investment. So we've steered away from some claim that it'll be a lot more efficient and save a whole lot of money, because none of us were really confident. If you have a look at other reforms, that's just generally not the way it turns out.
Mm. And I think for those of us from Tamaki Makaurau, we can absolutely say that, that is not how reform ends up saving money. But, the critical path is it's a very good sort of steer on how to proceed. But we also need to remember that this is a 30-year time frame, and that this isn't a revolutionary process. And, although there is a gentle hand in the back of local government to proceed along the timeline and to review and to make change for the better, it also needs to be done at the pace that works for the local councils involved. So, as we said in answer to the previous question, change what can be changed with ease, but work collaboratively on the things that can be changed over time. But this is not going to be a big bang and instant change, and neither should it be approached from that direction.
There are some things that will take time, and there are other things, and we have, particularly in terms of thinking about other reforms that are currently underway, and said there is an opportunity to align the timetable of those reforms and ours so that the sector isn't subject to 3 reorganisations, for example, at the same time, which would be exhausting. So there is an opportunity to think about the timetabling of some of those steps, even a bit acknowledging Penny's point. Even within that, we're suggesting that some of this could be done in tranches, given that some will be better placed to start and others may need some more time. So it wouldn't be necessarily just a one mandated change program that would apply. Fergus again.
So we have a couple of questions here. I'll take one from the chat first, and then Patrick, you can ask yours if you'd like to after that. So could the panel please explain what their thinking was on page 111, where they suggest that audit requirements for LTPs could be streamlined or disestablished? That's under the leading change in system renewal section in the report.
Yeah, sure, and I'm happy to sort of start on that one. Throughout the process, particularly on LTPs, many felt that the conversation was crowded out by the process, and part of the process challenge was audit, and audit actually providing expectations, how it thought consultation and engagement should occur, and what were the critical issues and how that should be reflected in the document. And that caused a bit of angst across the sector in the conversations that we had. in a redefined long-term plan process, I think there is an opportunity to think where is there value, and if there is, where is that value of the audit process in an LTP, and I comment I made to the Deputy Controller and Auditor General the other day when I was having a chat with him about this was saying, to some extent, it might depend a little bit where Affordable Waters ends up. If they end up in separate entities as currently defined, then the principal planning responsibility and asset and long-term management will transfer from councils to those entities. If that occurs, then from my experience, that is probably the area which has been the most challenging in terms of the underlying information. To a lesser degree, transport has a secondary mechanism through the Waka Kotahi co-investment process, which requires sort of an agreement. So there's perhaps a little more assurance that comes from that type of process. So I think it will depend a little bit on that, and it'll depend on what does a redesigned LTP process and system look like, and what are the outputs and what level of assurance is being sought. So I could imagine that either the scope of that audit is significantly reduced, or with growing confidence in the capability and capacity of local government to deliver quality long-term planning, that the assurance role that audit has played, and I'd acknowledge, while I am a confessed previous auditor in another life, I would acknowledge that audit at times has added significant value where some councils haven't necessarily got all of their assumptions aligned appropriately in their LTPs. But I think we are maturing and developing, and so there's an opportunity to revisit that. Kia ora. Fergus, was there another?
Yes, Patrick, if you'd like to ask your question, you're welcome to now.
Kia ora, thanks, Fergus. Thank you, panel. And Brendan, I just wanted to call out that sounds bad. Celebrate the clarity that you gave just before around the focus on effectiveness rather than efficiency. I think that was implicit throughout the whole report, but it was really useful hearing it said out loud in that kind of way. And I think that'll be useful for central government to hear as well. So yeah, thank you very much for that. I just want to say, if I'm reading correctly, you're recommending the kind of reforming the structure and form of local government, and then subsequently considering any potential changes or split of sort of where powers are distributed between local and central government. That sort of setting the form and then setting the function. I could see a version of the report that had that the other way around, setting function and form first. Did you have conversations about that? Could you speak to why you chose to go with setting form first and then function afterwards? Thanks very much.
Yes, thanks, Patrick. Yeah, we can all chip in there, and if you've been a fly on the wall in some of our conversations, I've described it in some other forums as a bit of the proverbial Gordian knot. What the roles and responsibilities that a particular organisation undertake as a function of its capacity and capability, and also who funds those. And we often had a four-legged stool of funding, roles and responsibilities, relationships between central and local government, and the capacity and capability of local government to be able to deliver. And ultimately we landed in a place where while many textbooks and a number who submitted to us suggested that you can only work out your form once you've worked out your function, we've actually suggested almost a two-stage process. The first is, as part of a reorganisation, there does need to be a conversation about, within the region and for the existing activities that are undertaken by local government, who's best placed to deliver those, and therefore what are the functions that are undertaken, and what form would best, and structures and operating model would best give effect and to do that. So there does need to be a little bit of that for the existing role. Once I think particularly with a central government hat on, once that organisation form is known, then they can sit down, and this is where the relational department comes in, sitting down with councils over time, looking at roles and responsibilities at a regional, sub-regional level, and saying who's best placed to deliver, whether it's community, local, locally, regionally, or nationally. And some things, possibly need to go up a level. One I often talk about is building control. At the moment, building control, consenting activity. Councils do that as an agent of the Crown, and the reason we do it as an agent of the Crown is there's quite a bit of risk around it. But we give effect to some national codes, and there's not a great deal of discretion in the way in which you apply that. That particularly the processing of that could be done nationally, and possibly to the relief of a lot of local government if it was, albeit you still need a distributed model. So once we had certainty around the form of local government, or at least the initial form of local government following a reorganisation, we then felt that central government and local government in particular as being the major two, although there are others, hapuiwi and Māori and community that need to be involved in those conversations. You then have a sense of who has the capability to be able to lead those particular roles and activities, and how best to deliver them, and what's best in Southland will not be what's best in Northland, and ensuring that there is flexibility to have conversations, but acknowledging also that it's going to take some time for that to happen. Not going to go through, there are dozens of functions and roles that are undertaken by central and local government, when it's unlikely that we're going to have a big sit down and a big bang clear out of them all. And it might be a progressive conversation that happens, and that's where we see the relational department in particular being very important, in being able to recognise the strengths of local government, the capabilities of local government, and being able to broker an honest conversation about, and a grown up, mature conversation about where best can activities occur. Without that sense of who are we talking with for the future, then we thought it would be very difficult for central government to commit, say, having that conversation based on the current structure of local government across the country. It would be difficult to see any significant change occurring. Other panel, Brendan and Gail.
I'm not sure it's quite that linear, and in our report we have really emphasised the importance to experiment and learn and try some things, and the relational department, or that new entity, and its responsibility for place-based deals, there is an opportunity to try some of these things before a new organisational form is set up. So I think it's a bit of a both and. I agree with what Jim's just said, and I think that there's scope for trialling some things and learning by doing. We're really aware that context is really important, and as Jim said, what works in Southland might not work in the Hawke's Bay. So there does need to be a recognition of that, and whatever happens about the future roles and functions needs to take that and be able to take that into account. So we're quite excited about the opportunity for councils to negotiate with central government around trying some of these things first and learning from that experience and sharing that across the whole system.
The only other thing I'd add, and I think it's a great question, Patrick, is you're absolutely right. A lot of the literature would say get your form follows function, but a couple of things that also sort of context was really important. This is a local government system. It's not just a single organisation, and that theory applies better in an organisation than it does across an entire system. And secondly, we're really talking about a reorganisation of governance not management lines and functions in the traditional organizational sense. So, taking all those things into account, and as Jim and Gail mentioned, we really decided to use form as an anchor for those other changes subsequent, and that was the way we went in the finish.
Thanks, Patrick, for your question. Did you have another one that you wanted to ask of the panel?
Nope, I just forgot to take my hand down. Thanks very much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Patrick. Fergus, anything else in the Q&A?
That's the end of the questions in the chat. It looks like we're about out of time anyway. So,
well, look, we're coming to a close. Look, thank you very much for firstly participating today and listening to the conversation. We've really enjoyed the questions that have been posed to us, very thoughtful, and look, it's allowed us to give a little more context, which we hope you find useful as well. And thank you also for the interest you've shown in the review throughout, and reading our final report. That's greatly appreciated by the panel. We wish you well as you think about the role that you can play, and I think a comment that was made earlier about the importance of how do we collectively show the intent of local government in such a way that it's clear that central government has no option but to engage. So, the alignment of the effort of local government as it thinks and responds to the review, we see as being critical to successful change occurring. So with that, on behalf of the panel, thank you again very much, and we wish you well. Ka kite.